Hi, this is an introduction to philosophy in which we explore some of the ultimate questions that philosophers ask. My name is Mark Thorsby, and today we're continuing our video series here on how I ought to act. This is the first two videos, or this is really the second video here, in our discussion of moral philosophy. And today we're looking at this question: do the ends justify the means? So welcome back, everyone. Essentially, this question, whether or not the ends can justify the means, is essentially a question about consequentialism. From our last video, we made the distinction between consequentialist theories in ethics and non-consequentialist theories in ethics. A consequentialist theory in ethics is any theory in which the consequences of one's actions are morally relevant to the action itself. And a non-consequentialist system would say, for instance, like Kant says, that the consequences that proceed out of our actions are morally irrelevant to whether or not those actions are morally obligatory or not. So anyway, last time we looked at Immanuel Kant, who's a non-consequentialist, who basically lays out a series of duties and a procedure, the categorical imperative, that we can use to determine what those morally obligatory actions are. This week, but in this second video, we're going to be asking, wait a second, don't the consequences matter? And this is our general introduction to utilitarian moral theory. So welcome back, everyone. I hope you guys are doing well. I want to start off with this sort of question here, which I'm calling terrorism, torture, and the ticking time bomb. Many of you, I'm sure, are aware of the large debate surrounding waterboarding that ensued in the United States following the Iraq invasion and the manner in which the United States treated enemy combatants once those enemy combatants were arrested. So, in fact, many of them were tortured, which resulted in little, if no, evidence to further the war effort and so on and so forth. And basically, the use of torture has been extraordinarily reviewed and contested along a series of lines. Now, no one's arguing, I don't think, that torture is justified in itself. The question, though, becomes, what if you're facing an imminent catastrophe, such as a nuclear bomb or something like this? Is torture justified? Now, before asking this question, because remember, the function of this question is to tease out the consequential nature of our actions. Let me remind you of a couple things. First off, let's imagine in this scenario that there is a ticking time bomb, and it's a nuclear bomb. And let's imagine it's in downtown Houston, such that, or you can pick New York, wherever you want. It's in a large metropolitan area, such that if that bomb goes off, hundreds of thousands, if not potentially a million or more people will be killed. So we're talking about a serious scenario. And keep in mind that this scenario has existed potentially and could exist in the future. And in all likelihood will eventually exist. So let's imagine this scenario, this ticking time bomb. Now, let's also remind ourselves that torture is illegal in the United States. According to the U.S. Code, Title 18, Section 2340, Paragraph 2, torture defined as any harm or perceived harm used to interrogate an individual is considered illegal. Now, this is the actual law in the United States. Now, the debate over waterboarding has been the question about whether or not waterboarding counts as torture or an enhanced interrogation technique, as, for instance, someone as prominent as the former Vice President of the United States, Dick Cheney, contends. Now, so let's imagine. So let's keep all of this, and let's actually assume that waterboarding is torture, because under the United States Geneva Convention signed after the end of hostilities in the Second World War, waterboarding was classified as a form of torture. So we're going to ignore the Dick Cheney post 9/11 sort of discussion, and we're just going to assume it's torture, right? But even if we assume it is torture, isn't torture justified in stopping the ticking time bomb? In fact, here's an actual photograph of U.S. service personnel performing a waterboarding procedure on another, I believe this is just another fellow soldier, in terms of preparing our soldiers for being tortured and this sort of thing. But let's ask ourselves, isn't torture justified if it can save millions, right? That is, think about it in this nature. If considering what we looked at last week, or last video here with Immanuel Kant, Kant argues that we should always abide by the law. That was the kingdom of ends formulation, if you'll recall. But here we're asking the question, well, wait a second. Shouldn't we be willing to suspend the law if, by following the law, millions of people could be killed, or thousands of people, or whatnot? Don't the lives of the individuals isn't our ability to perhaps save their lives, doesn't that supersede a more theoretical discussion of our obligation to abide by the law? And so this raises an interesting question. And here I actually encourage you to pause the video and actually think it through. What do you really think is the justified scenario? Should you be willing to, how far would you be willing to go to stop the ticking time bomb? Would you be willing to dismember a person, for instance, if it would stop a nuclear bomb? Obviously, that's an extreme form of torture that I think all of us find morally reprehensible, but the consequentialist domain of the question remains whether we're talking about waterboarding or dismemberment. If the consequences of the action are such that they're enormously beneficial for a large amount of people, aren't we justified in acting that way? This, of course, is a classic problem within utilitarianism and within moral theories that are consequential in nature. And you can see here that I sort of kind of illustrated the ways in which we can understand the problem with consequences here. On the one hand, here's the two possible actions we could take. We could abide by the law, but the consequence of that could be a nuclear detonation in a large metropolitan area. Or our action could be to torture the individual, which we concede here is illegal. So we'll be breaking the law, but by breaking the law, we may be saving thousands of lives. So here's sort of the dynamic, and you might say that on the one hand, most of us consider that abiding by the law as a moral duty, but the more desirable consequence here is saving thousands of people. So there's a sort of asymmetry here between our actions and our consequences. And we can use that asymmetry to understand how utilitarians might answer the question. So here's what I'm going to do. There's lots of different utilitarians, and interestingly enough, there's utilitarians who may agree or disagree with the ticking time bomb scenario. Although our general intuition, I think, is to say that, yeah, you should torture the person, and it gives you better consequences. Now, but let's think about this. What would a utilitarian say? What is utilitarianism in general? Well, utilitarianism refers to a core branch of ethical and moral theory that argues that our actions should be seen as utilities. Think about what is a utility. Think about, for instance, when you pay your utilities. When you pay your utilities, you're paying for what you use, right? You pay for how much water you use or how much electricity you use. You pay by consumption. Essentially, the idea of utilitarianism is that our actions should be seen as utilities. And we use our actions, we act in certain ways to promote what we might call is the general happiness principle. Oops, I'll just stay here on it. The general happiness principle. And the general happiness principle is actually formulated by a philosopher named John Stuart Mill. We'll come to him in here in just a moment. But it's basically this idea that we should promote the greatest amount of happiness for the greatest amount of people. Now, how we define happiness is obviously critical to this account here, because if we're going to say that you should promote the greatest amount of happiness, we need to understand what we mean by happiness. So we'll get to that in a moment, but here the basic idea is that actions are right in proportion as they tend to promote happiness, and they're wrong wrong as they tend to produce the reverse of happiness. So an action is right if it promotes happiness, consequentially. An action is wrong if it promotes the reverse of happiness, consequentially. But the general principle is that I'm not just interested in promoting my happiness, but promoting the total welfare of all, the greatest amount of happiness. Okay, so you have to make sure you understand that in theory. Our actions are utilities, and they switch back to the last screen. Our actions are utilities but we're using these actions to promote the greatest amount of happiness for ourselves, but also for the combined total, the whole of society in general, right? So there's an egalitarian emphasis in utilitarianism, the idea that everyone's happiness should be equally considered. So not just my happiness, not just the happiness of the president or whatnot, or the happiness of the CEOs in the corporations, but the happiness of all, right? Okay, so let's take a little, I want to do here utilitarianism, the history of theory. So I want to give you a little bit of the framework for how we can understand utilitarianism, both conceptually as well as in terms of its emergence, I think. And the first sort of thing here is its historical context. It's worth noting here that utilitarianism begins in an age of revolution. It begins in an age of enlightenment, in an age of industrialization, and it also invokes, I think, an age of social reform. Now, the utilitarianism fundamentally comes out of the work of Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill. Both of these thinkers lived during the Industrial Revolution in England, notably. So this is a homegrown English theory here regarding social action and determining wrong and right moral actions based upon their holistic impact in the society. Now, why is this important? Think about what's happening during the Industrial Revolution in England. Number one is everything is transforming before their eyes. An egalitarian society for thousands of years, that is a society of farmers and herdsmen, essentially is transformed during the 19th century, 18th, and then of course maybe the 19th century, into a society of industrialists, factory workers, and consumers, and an entire new model of economy develops. Now, because of this, all of the basic social hierarchies that had developed throughout the United Kingdom for centuries had essentially been dislodged. And in fact, we might even say that this process of dislodging social hierarchies has continued in each society that industrializes. The most notable example today is China. And it'd be interesting here to look at, for instance, the ways in which industrialism, for instance, is impacting Chinese culture toward, I bet, a more utilitarian, egalitarian model. So all of this is happening. Also, this is also occurring right here in the age of, or really right past the age of Enlightenment. So these thinkers, Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill, are well acquainted with the writings of Immanuel Kant. And so, because Immanuel Kant writes much earlier, but you're going to see they offer a very different moral theory, one that I think accords much closer to our moral intuition, but is not without its own problems. The other thing worth stating is that utilitarianism, once it developed into its sort of full-fledged form in the work of Mill, eventually helped spur a whole momentum of social reform and change, including such things as eventually the women's suffrage movement. For instance, John Stuart Mill writes a famous book on the vindication of the rights of women. So you might even say that John Stuart Mill here is a proto-feminist, or the first feminist of the modern era, arguing that women should be counted equally with men. The greatest amount of happiness for the greatest amount of people includes men and women equally, not just men. As obviously the hierarchy of the day, and perhaps even our own, seems to direct us towards. The other thing here is notable is that utilitarianism also became a huge momentum for advocating, for instance, universal education within a society and compulsory education. It's notable that in the 19th century, after industrialism, we see the idea in both England and the United States, and then increasingly around the world, that the state has an obligation to actually educate children. And we're going to see why that is here in just a moment. So for those of you who may have just come out of high school, you're thinking, you're so glad to finally be out of compulsory education. We're going to be talking today about why it's necessary, at least from a utilitarian perspective. Okay, so that's a little bit of a context, but the real sort of nuts and bolts of the theory begins with the philosopher by the name of Jeremy Bentham, who lived from 1748 to 1832. And Jeremy Bentham is I wouldn't necessarily say is the absolute first person to promote utilitarianism, but definitely one of the most important and major early utilitarian philosophers. In fact, we might even say that utilitarianism perhaps may not have existed at all had not Jeremy Bentham authored his work on utilitarianism as he did. Now, Jeremy Bentham, we go back, we were talking about earlier, we said the greatest happiness principle, which is formulated later, not by Jeremy Bentham, but we said that it was the greatest amount of happiness for the greatest amount of people. But the question was, what exactly is happiness? And Jeremy Bentham defines happiness here as pleasure, right? And he thinks that's irreducible and an easy thing to reduce it to because, well, first off, we should not reduce, but we should understand happiness as pleasure because all people seek pleasure, for one. And on the other hand, all people naturally have a capacity for pleasure. And so you might even say that pleasure functions as the natural ground upon which we can articulate moral conceptions of action, since all of us are universally pleasure seekers. Now you can see here, when we looked in our previous video of Immanuel Kant, one of the problems we discussed was, are human beings really fully rational? And we're going to see here that Bentham and especially Mill are going to keep on to this idea that human beings are rational. We can see here that utilitarianism isn't purely dependent upon the rationality of the individuals, because it also includes within it the necessity that human beings are pleasure seekers. We're looking for happiness, and by that we're looking to enjoy ourselves. We're looking for pleasure, right? That just seems an obvious truism, I suppose. And so given that, he defines happiness as pleasure, and he articulates not the greatest happiness principle, but what he calls the principle of utility. And the principle of utility is that we are required to produce as much happiness as possible, right? So morally. So that means we're required to produce the most amount of pleasure possible, right? Both in our own lives as well as in the lives of others, right? And in pursuit of developing this theory of utility here, Jeremy Bentham articulated what's known as the philosophic calculus, sometimes referred to as the hedonic calculus. But the philosophic calculus is essentially an algorithm for calculating pleasures. You see, Jeremy Bentham believed that we could calculate what our actions should be based upon a calculation of how much pleasure those actions can create, or consequentially. Okay. Now, he identifies a series in the calculus. Part of his algorithm is he says we have to determine, whenever we take a certain pleasure, we have to determine the different ways in which that pleasure, the different, I guess, the nuances that our pleasures have, because not all pleasures are equal, right? For instance, watching this video and learning about utilitarianism hopefully gives you some sort of intellectual pleasure. But that intellectual pleasure is very different than the sort of pleasure you may experience, for instance, during sexual intercourse, or some other bodily event, right? Or think of all the different pleasures. There's a whole range of pleasures. How is it that we can compare them so as to determine how we ought to act? Well, first is we should take a look at, oh, this one doesn't go through. Okay, I'm trying to zoom in, but for some reason it won't let me. The first thing here we take a look at is the intensity of the pleasure, and that means how strong is the pleasure. So, for instance, if we go back to my example here of sexual intercourse versus learning about utilitarianism, clearly the intensity is on the side of the sexual interaction. It's not on the side of learning about utilitarianism, as much as I contend that that is an intellectual pleasure. So intensity is the first criteria, but it's not the sole criteria in the philosophic calculus. We have to also consider the duration. That is, how long will the pleasure last? And here you can see that utilitarianism, or at least you're gaining knowledge here, has a leg up in terms of its duration. That is, once one understands and gains the intellectual pleasure of what utilitarianism is, the duration of that knowledge continues far into the future, whereas, for instance, the duration of a sexual act is very short by contrast. So it may be high intensity, but it's low duration. Whereas an intellectual pleasure here, we might say, is high duration, low intensity. Though there are certain intellectual pleasures I think that have high intensity as well. Now, the next that's the second criteria. The third criteria is the certainty of the pleasure, and that is how likely is that pleasure to ensue from your actions. Now, remember, our actions are tools; they're utilities we use to create pleasure. So sometimes we miscalculate, or through probability of the world, right? Just the inability to know everything, our actions don't actually create pleasure. So there's a certain sort of likelihood or probability that our actions can actually create pleasure. So that means we have to not only evaluate the intensity of the duration, but also the certainty. How likely is my pleasure? How likely is my action to actually create that pleasure? The next thing is the remoteness of the pleasure. And by remoteness, we're talking about time. That is, how soon will the pleasure occur? So for instance, think about your education. Hopefully you're taking all of these classes and you're gaining all of this intellectual knowledge, which is something of an intellectual pleasure. But how remote is the sort of payoff going to be here? It may be further off than you think. So, and think also here about, for instance, think about any of the actions we take, really. Think about, for instance, when we choose types of food. Should I eat a salad or should I eat a hamburger? Right? Well, if I eat a salad, it may have low intensity, but it has but I know that I'm not going to feel sick from eating it. Whereas if I eat a hamburger, I may enjoy it quite intense at the moment while I'm eating it, but I'll probably get a stomachache afterwards, right? So how far off is the pleasure going to be? Now, fecundity is very similar. Fecundity refers to what's the probability of one pleasure producing another pleasure. So let me give you an example here. Of fecundity, by the way, is originally an agricultural term, and it refers to the idea of a field having fecundity, right? That is, when you plant in a field, how likely or how good is that field going to be to reproduce the next crop? And you know, of course, that we let fields lie fallow so that we can let them sort of become reinvested with nutrients so that the field can remain productive in the out years, right? So fecundity refers to the ability for a pleasure to create another pleasure. So we can also talk about the negative fecundity of our actions. What do I mean by negative fecundity? Think here about antibiotic usage. Most of us have taken antibiotics when we've gotten sick, but here's the problem with antibiotics. Every time an antibiotic is prescribed, that means that we're actually reintroducing a pathogen, a bacterial pathogen, to a antibacterial, or in this case, an antibiotic substance that kills it. But we know that the pathogens over time gain resistance to the antibiotics, such that the more we use antibiotics, the less effective they become. In fact, this is actually happening right now. And in fact, it's predicted that within a generation, within my lifetime, it's predicted that most antibiotics that are currently in use today will no longer be useful. So that means that antibiotic usage has negative fecundity. The more we use it, the less likely the pleasure will be there for the future. Now, obviously, for Bentham, the pleasures we want to pursue are the ones that have high fecundity and not negative fecundity, though he's willing to accept negative fecundity if that's the best we can do. So I'm not saying here that Jeremy Bentham would be, he may be critical, but I don't think he would think that we shouldn't prescribe antibiotics when people become sick. Okay? Finally, the next here is the purity of a pleasure, and the purity refers to will the action be followed by pain. That is, the purer the pleasure, then that pleasure will not result in further pain. A good example of this would be, for instance, go to a nightclub on a Saturday night, right? And you open the door and you see all the people dancing and drinking. And everyone looks like they're in a state of pleasure. But the problem is the pleasure they're enjoying, for the most part, is an impure pleasure. And by impure, what I mean is that most of the people who drink heavily here, right, because there's pleasure in the drink and so they keep drinking, those people are going to develop horrible dehydration and then, of course, some sort of hangover the next morning, which means that the pleasure of drinking or debauchery is followed by a subsequent pain. So if a pleasure creates pain, then ultimately it has low purity. A good example of this would be sexual intercourse, for instance. You can imagine two people for purely natural reasons pursuing pleasure, having intercourse, for instance, having sex. But let's say they have unprotected sex, and then one of them contracts a sexually transmitted disease. So in this case, the pleasure of sexual intercourse is followed by the pain of a permanent disease, potentially. So you can see here that not all actions are equal, right? And so it's important that we calculate whether or not our actions are going to result in what types of pleasures or pains, potentially. And finally, the last one here is the extent. And the extent is pretty critical here because it refers to how many people will be affected by the pleasure, that is, how many people will be affected in the sense of gaining pleasure, right? So you can imagine, for instance, that my action of posting this video, hopefully, is one in which I can help, send out knowledge into the world where people can act more morally or something like this, right? Hopefully there's a high extent to the action, pleasure. There's a high extent to the pleasures I can create by posting these YouTube videos. Whereas by contrast, if we go back to our friend at the nightclub who decides to have a one-night stand, this person has a very low extent. The pleasure is only for two people. Maybe a couple others are affected, but it doesn't have a large extension. So ideally you can see here that we can begin to sort of kind of almost calculate and sort of assign locations to our pleasures based upon their intensity, their duration, their certainty, their remoteness, their fecundity, their purity, and their extension, how far they extend. Obviously, the best pleasures will be high on all counts, though that doesn't seem to always be the case. So this was Jeremy Bentham's philosophic calculus that really gets utilitarianism going headstrong in the 19th century. So the next person here I want to mention is, of course, John Stuart Mill. Here's a picture of him. He's not too pretty, but he's certainly a genius. And he essentially seeks to redefine utilitarianism. Now, a quick note about John Stuart Mill here. John Stuart Mill is essentially the next generation of thinkers after Bentham. In fact, John Stuart Mill's father was very good friends with Jeremy Bentham, and when he was a boy, Jeremy Bentham would often come to his house for dinner, and so he actually was well personally acquainted with both utilitarianism and Jeremy Bentham. But he had a problem here, which is namely, wait a second, for Jeremy Bentham, all of our pleasures are equal, and we just calculate which are the pleasures we should pursue based upon this algorithm. But John Stuart Mill says, but wait a second, are all of the pleasures equal? It seems to me that we can talk about the quantity of pleasures, at least that's John Stuart Mill speaking here, that we can talk about the quantities of pleasure, how many pleasures we can get, but we have to make a distinction about the quality of pleasure. That is, pleasure may be qualitatively distinct. There are some pleasures that they can't be compared, right? There's apples and oranges that even the philosophic calculus is unable to compare. And so he makes a famous distinction here between higher pleasures on the one hand and lower pleasures on the other. And this distinction functions as really quite pivotal and central in Mill's account of utilitarianism. Though I will say that he doesn't deny that pleasure is how you would define happiness. He just wants to say there's higher versus lower pleasures. Now let's talk about the higher pleasures. The higher pleasures, he says, are those that are derived through the higher faculties. And so as such, when we talk about the higher pleasures, we're essentially talking about the mental pleasures, right? These are pleasures that are derived through the mind, essentially. So we can talk about mental pleasures, for instance, reading a great philosophy book, right? Which I know most of you are doing. There's mental pleasure in that. Like I said, it may not have high intensity, but it does have long duration and high fecundity. Aesthetic pleasure, for instance, think about the pleasure one derives when they go to the museum and look at the great works of art, right? This is an aesthetic pleasure, but it depends upon our ability to conceptualize and understand what we see. And of course, moral pleasures as well. Think about the pleasure one receives when they do what's right, when they help another person, for instance. There is pleasure in that, and that's one of these higher pleasures. Now, I put in here that these pleasures tend towards low intensity but high duration. Now, these pleasures, though, required education and mental cultivation. That is, John Stuart Mill does not think that we're naturally predisposed towards the higher pleasures. That is, the higher pleasures are the result of cultivating our mental capacities. By contrast, the lower pleasures, right, are quite natural. They don't require education or mental cultivation. These are utterly natural pleasures. And so generally what we're talking about here is we're talking about pleasures that are derived through the lower bodily functions. So we can talk about mental pleasures and bodily pleasures, and that gets close to the distinction between higher and lower pleasures. Though John Stuart Mill he doesn't use that terminology for a reason. But by examples here, for instance, are sexual pleasure, culinary pleasure. I love a good gourmet meal, and other bodily pleasures. Now, let me make clear here that John Stuart Mill, he clearly is going to give priority to the higher pleasures, but he's not saying that the lower pleasures are bad. Not at all. He's saying these are natural, and this is what human beings naturally wish to attain, and that means that they have to take place within our moral system of action here, right? But the problem here is that these pleasures, while they're natural, they're not always rational, right? And this is why, for instance, people often pursue the lower pleasures, and it can, even though utilitarians would say you should pursue pleasure here, pursuing nothing but lower pleasures ultimately may lead to a bad life, right? Because ultimately you may be giving up something that the higher pleasures can only give you. For instance, imagine this. Most of you are taking this video, watching this video, you're 32 minutes in. Why are you watching it so long? Certainly it's boring, right? Whereas, for instance, compare, while you're watching this video, someone out there in the world right now is watching a movie or playing World of Warcraft and getting high or something, right? So imagine there's someone out there who's your age, who's pursuing bodily pleasure, and here you are pursuing a mental pleasure. And you can imagine, for instance, that while the lower pleasures are important, if one pursues nothing but the lower pleasures, clearly their life is not going to be fulfilled at the same level as a person who pursues the higher faculties. Now, so which pleasures are better here? I have two quotes that I want to give you from John Stuart Mill. The first here is that a being of higher faculties, this is the person who has cultivated their mind, requires more to make him happy, is capable probably of more acute suffering, and is certainly accessible to it at more points than one of an inferior type. So first off, think about what he's saying here. He's saying that a person who cultivates the mental pleasures is actually more prone to suffering than the person who doesn't cultivate those higher pleasures, right? And they may have more suffering, and they may not be as easily or even as happy, right? But read on. What does he say? And it is certainly, he says, but in spite of these liabilities, he can never really wish to sink into what he feels to be a lower grade of existence. So he thinks here that the higher pleasures, once we've cultivated the higher pleasures or the higher capacities of the mind, we ultimately don't, even if there's more suffering, we don't want to go back to the lower pleasures. And he has this is the very famous quote you may have seen. He says, it's better to be Socrates dissatisfied than to be a pig, an animal that's satisfied, right? Socrates is the paragon of moral and mental achievement, and a pig is simply a lower bodily, is nothing but a sort of lower body, if you will. And he says, listen, it's better to be Socrates, someone who has mental cultivation and be in suffering, than it is to be a non-suffering animal. So you can see here that clearly the qualitative priority that Mill gives is towards the higher pleasures. Now, there's one other thing that's worth mentioning here, though, and that's the idea that the higher pleasures are easily destroyed. he says, like a tender plant, the higher pleasures can be destroyed. Um, for instance, think about if even people who have education, think about during World War II, right? Um, World War II during the Holocaust, right? And think of all the horror that went on in that period, right? In that period, even people who had mental cultivations, once the Nazis started rounding the gypsies and the Jews and any of the outcasts of German society up and then executing them, working them to death, essentially, and putting them in ghettos and so on and so forth. Once the Nazis began to do this, they began to destroy the very possibility for the lower pleasures, actually. And in so doing, it became impossible for the higher pleasures to actually be achieved. So he says here that the higher pleasures can be destroyed quite easily by circumstance and by need and want. For instance, you can study philosophy all day, and that's great and well and good, but if you're starving to death, it doesn't matter, right? So you can see here there's an impetus here, or a reason that we can see why we have to have a certain sort of social organization that promotes the higher pleasures. Because the reason we have politics in general, we might even say, is in order to allow us to have more than simply the lower pleasures, right? Or we might say politics protects both spheres, the lower and the higher, though the higher are easily destroyed. And takes a long time to cultivate them. Okay, so that's a sort of sense about the higher and lower pleasure distinction we see in John Stuart Mill, which doesn't. So you can see he rejects the philosophic calculus, at least in terms of it being a sufficient algorithm for calculating pleasure, because it treats all pleasures the same, and they're not all the same if we have these mental versus these bodily pleasures. Now, the next thing I want to mention here regarding utilitarianism which is quite important, is that we're talking about happiness for all, not just the happiness for a singular individual like myself, but we're talking about collective happiness, right? Now, here's the first thing, though, is that the happiness of each member of society is counted equal. We're talking about a one-to-one relation. That means that my happiness is equal, at least in terms of how we're supposed to calculate the accumulation of happiness, right? The greatest amount of happiness for the greatest amount of people. My happiness is equal to yours, and your happiness is equal to another person that you don't like. All members in our society have an equal stake, right? Corporations don't have a larger stake. Politicians don't have a larger stake in happiness. You don't have a larger stake in happiness. All of us should be treated equally. Okay? So given that actions, and there's a little spelling error, my apologies, actions are morally right if their consequences result in a net increase in the happiness of all, not the individual. So that means that utilitarianism says that we calculate what happiness will be produced by our actions, but then we have to calculate the extension, what Bentham calls the extension of that happiness to all people within the society, or at least all people who are affected by the action. So number 3 here, and I have two quotes from John Stuart Mill, pardon me. And the first here is that laws and social arrangement should place the happiness or the interest of every individual as nearly as possible in harmony with the interest of the whole. So that means that there's a sort of there's this other idea that Mill has, that we need to understand what the collective happiness is and our individual happiness, and we need to find a harmonic position between the two, or a harmonic relation between the two. And then how can we do that? Well, through education, really. And this goes to the idea of cultivating the higher mental faculties from Mill. He writes, quote, "Education and opinion, which have so vast a power over human character, should so use that power as to establish in the mind of every individual an indissoluble association between his own happiness and the good of the whole." Sorry, my tongue is getting wrapped up. Right? But the idea here is that an indissoluble association between his own happiness and the good of the whole. So the idea here is that he says we should use education in opinion. So you can think about the media as a fundamental way in which opinion is generated and shaped by our society, that education and, for instance, the media need to be used in order to promote happiness within the mind. In order to promote the idea of the harmony between the individual's happiness and the happiness of the whole, right? And that's one of the reasons, that's the philosophical justification for having a compulsory education system. The reason we say everyone who's between ages such and such, between, I don't know, ages 5 and 18 or something, the reason we say they have to go to school is because we think that they need to cultivate these higher faculties. Otherwise, they're going to be unable, right, to understand or calculate how to find, how to sort of kind of, I guess, balance their own individual happiness with that of the whole. So utilitarianism isn't possible unless we cultivate these higher faculties to do this. So that means that it's necessary to our society, of our civil social interest, that we force people to go to school. And so we have, as a liberal democracy, we've decided to take away the freedom of choice from individual citizens, right? The choice to choose whether or not to be educated. We say, no, all people have to be educated. So you can see this is a powerful motivating force, or powerful argument here. And it's had an enormous impact on the 20th century, the 19th to 20th century, and hopefully going forward. But it's happiness for all. So what are some other real key points that I want to mention? Well, let me talk about that. The first is I want to make a distinction between act utilitarianism on the one hand and rule utilitarianism on the other. Act utilitarianism we can summarize as the idea of using the utilitarian calculus here, the greatest happiness principle, to determine each individual action. So that means that before I walk out the door, before I decide to before I decide to act in such and such a way, I should calculate whether or not that action will promote the greatest amount of happiness for the greatest amount of people and so forth. But you can see that becomes very problematic very quick for a number of reasons. Number one, I'm not always thinking about other people, right? I'm just not. That's just the facts, right? I often am thinking about myself. And so that means that it looks like it's too difficult psychologically to always be a utilitarian, where I consider each act in this utilitarian calculus. Another problem with act utilitarianism isn't just the idea that I have to calculate each act, another problem isn't just that I tend to think of myself quite a bit, but it's also the idea that many times I have to act without thinking, right? I don't have time to make a calculation. So for instance, imagine I'm standing at a bus stop and I see a 12-year-old boy step forward, and then I see a bus coming to plow him over. Should I push him out of the way and save him and perhaps get killed myself or not? In order to determine that, if I was an act utilitarian, I would have to say, well, if he lives, then that means I'll die. If I die, my kids will grow up without a father, and that will create pain, but he'll live. And you can see by the time I've calculated anything, it's gone, it's over, it's too late. So determining each action individually, case by case, just appears too onerous. So what we have here is rule utilitarianism in response. And rule utilitarianism says, okay, instead what we'll do is we'll create general rules that do promote the greatest amount of happiness for the greatest amount of people. Maybe not in every single circumstance, but by large measure they do, these rules, and we'll live by those rules. And so then essentially we don't have to calculate everything all the time, or each action. We essentially adopt specific rules that guide our action that allow us to make autonomous and accelerated decisions that are in conformity with the utilitarian moral system. And so rule utilitarianism appears to be an innovation above act utilitarianism, quite frankly. And we might even say that rule utilitarianism is in very much the modeled philosophy for many legislatures who actually are running the halls of government. Now, so that's act utilitarianism, that's rule utilitarianism, and finally there's preference utilitarianism. And in terms of talking about preference utilitarianism, I want to tell you about one of the major preference utilitarians, and his name is Peter Singer. He actually is alive today. He's a great philosopher. He teaches at Princeton University. And I'm simplifying his view here, obviously, because I'm giving it to you in 5 minutes. But it sort of goes back to this question about, well, wait a second. both the act and the rule utilitarian, we have this idea that happiness is defined as pleasure. But the problem is that pleasures, well, they just seem too subjective, right? What may be pleasurable for me may not be pleasurable for you. You can see here that, for instance, the sadomasochist gives quite a bit of trouble to the utilitarian, right? Because the sadomasochist enjoys pain, right? They find pain as a certain type of pleasure, right? And so that becomes problematic to the utilitarian because it's subjective and you can't universalize something that people would all disagree on. And so what the preference utilitarian suggests is they say, instead of talking about pleasures, let's talk about preferences. Because we know that everyone has certain preferences. And maybe we could reformulate the greatest amount of happiness principle into a preference principle, where instead we get the idea that we should promote the greatest amount of preferences for the greatest amount of preference makers. Okay? So as a result, we can get out of this problem of figuring out which pleasures everyone agrees on. I have no idea. Let's not even try to do that. Instead, we know that all people have pleasures, they have preferences, and so what we want to do is promote essentially rules and actions that are going to allow people to have the greatest amount of preferences for the greatest amount of preference makers. But here's the thing. When we talk about preference makers, are we just talking about human beings? And for Singer, the answer is no. In fact, Peter Singer here is essentially one of the most important thinkers in terms of the development of the animal rights movement in the late 20th century and how it continues today. And so what is Singer's view in utilitarian animal rights? Well, he says, wait a second, if we're talking about preference makers, anything living has a preference, right? We notice that, for instance, the trees have a preference towards the sun. Animals have a preference not to be in pain, right? If you kick a dog, he makes a sad sound. That's because he prefers not to be kicked, right? So that means if animals have preference not to be in pain, then that means we must have an obligation to promote the greatest amount of preference for those preference makers. That means that we have to consider animals within our ethical calculus. And here's what's on the hook for you watching this video. Maybe eating meat is morally wrong. And here I really hope you take this seriously, because if Peter Singer is right and you are a meat eater, then that means that you are living an immoral life on utilitarian grounds. Okay, let's run through his sort of understanding of animal rights given the preference utilitarian. It's a good example here for us to think about. The first here is that animals have a preference not to be in pain, which means we have a duty here to avoid that as much as possible. Now, there's two types of life that we can talk about on Earth. On the one hand, there's conscious life. That's life that's simply sort of aware that there's a world around it. This would include plants, for instance. And on the other hand, there's self-conscious life, or sentient life. And that would be life that is not only conscious of the world, but conscious of itself as a unique individual in that world, right? That is, as an entity that has unique preferences in the world. And of course, what he's going to say here is, here we're talking about animal life, right? So in terms of conscious life, what he's going to argue is that because conscious life, plants, essentially, they have preferences, but they don't see themselves, they don't, at least as far as we can tell, they don't understand themselves as individuals within the world. That means that when we destroy plants, we should be bound by an obligation of replaceability. That is, we should replace that conscious life. So that means we should not clear-cut forest. If we cut down a forest for timber, we should replant that forest, right? So there's a very sort of kind of, I think, very good and sort of laudable norms coming out of his view here. But by contrast, self-conscious life, that is life that's not only aware of the world, but aware of itself in the world, is irreplaceable. That is because self-conscious life or sentient life understands that its own existence is irreplaceable. It can't be replaced because because it's an individual ultimately. And so as such, we have an obligation not to not put self-conscious life in pain. We shouldn't destroy it. Now, Peter Singer, he does make a distinction between humans versus animals in this regard, because he thinks that human beings, because of our rational capacity, have a much greater set of preferences. We can see ourselves as having preferences in the future, right? I can imagine myself as wanting to be an old man with grandchildren or something, right? Surrounded in some sort of euphoria in the forest or something. I don't know, right? But I have plans for the future. As such, if I'm killed, I'm not only in pain now and lose my present self, but I also lose my future self. Whereas a dog doesn't seem to see itself in the future, at least not 20 years into the future. Or I guess most dogs die in 20 years, so maybe 7 years in the future or something like that. As a result, human beings have a greater capacity for pain. And so that means that we may have, what do I want to say? There may be a sort of sliding scale of our obligations between animals. Singer, for instance, goes as far in his Practical Ethics book to say that it's very difficult to imagine what my ethical obligations are for a cockroach, for instance. The insect, obviously the insect has some sort of preferences, but it's very difficult for me to sort of for me to understand what that life would look like. And so so as we get further and further into the phrase of types of animal life, it becomes increasingly difficult to actually specify what the preferences, what our obligations for those preference makers are. So, but he contends that at least theoretically there's some sort of obligation, but he does contend that there's difficulty naming that obligation. And Singer's sort of theory here ultimately puts us on the hook, right? Because if you if you agree with him, that ultimately means that you have to consider all beings that have the potential for pain and pleasure or preferences within your moral calculus. Now, here's some problems to consider, and I'm just going to give these real quick here. The first here is the moral problems. You can imagine, what would a utilitarian say about euthanasia? Should we be willing to kill ourselves, or that is, should we be allowed to end our lives prematurely if we're in terminal and unending pain? Well, for the utilitarian, if we're talking about the greatest amount of pleasure for the greatest amount of people who are in constant pain should have the right to end that pain. And so most utilitarians are pro-euthanasia. Of course, public education, right? And public education becomes a moral problem for the utilitarian. You can think also about drug policy, for instance. Should for instance, drugs like marijuana be illegal? For instance, today there's a number of states who are changing their laws in this regard, but most have not. So you might be asked, what would a utilitarian say? Well, the utilitarian is going to say the greatest amount of people for the greatest amount of happiness for the greatest amount of people. And so the question is, how does your drug policy affect the overall condition of the society? Here we may need studies in order to determine this. Maybe it doesn't. Maybe it does or doesn't impact the society well or bad. But another thing here that John Stuart Mill articulated, I forgot to put in here, is the principle of harm. And the principle of harm is the idea that I should be allowed to do whatever I want for myself, so long as I don't harm others, right? So we should respect the autonomy of other moral agents, so long as that harm does not injure others. And so you might say that maybe some utilitarians would say that drugs should be legal privately in your own life, so long as you're not harming others. And then of course capital punishment is another one. For the utilitarian, capital punishment can only be justified on the grounds that it's a deterrent to stop future crimes. And in this case, if capital punishment is not a deterrent, then it's not justifiable, because it doesn't promote the greatest amount of happiness for the greatest amount of people in itself, not in the sense that a retribution might. So what are some of the theoretical problems? And there's a lot of theoretical problems we could talk about with regard to utilitarianism. The one is scope. So here the question is, if I'm talking about the greatest amount of happiness for the greatest amount of people, then the question is, well, how many people am I talking about, and how far into the future? Am I talking about all people in America, all people in my hometown, or am I talking about all people in the world? Also, am I talking about people who are alive today, or am I talking about people in the future? So for instance, think about global greenhouse emissions. If we continue to emit as much carbon in the atmosphere as we are going to irrevocably change the world for future generations in a negative way. And so does the utilitarian calculus include, or that is, how does the utilitarian determine the scope of moral obligation? This is a difficult problem. Another one is rights. Because for the utilitarian, actions are considered utilities. They're valued in terms of their usefulness or not. And so the question is, but when we think about rights, right, we think about the idea that people should have, with the idea that there's a moral obligation to someone else's right to, for instance, well, no, here's the thing. Think about a right that we have in the United States, the right to freely exercise your religion, right? We take that as a moral duty of the state to the individual, and it's not one of utility, right? The idea that we don't have that right because it's helpful to the society, right? We have that right to protect us because we believe that it's, as human beings, we should be able to do that, to choose who or what we may worship or not. Right? So the question of rights here seems to invoke a much more deontological system. And so the question becomes, how can the utilitarian firm up that conception of rights to accord with our natural moral intuition? Probably the best strategy is to use some form of rule utilitarianism, but even then, the rule utilitarian is going to ultimately say in a ticking time bomb scenario, you should break the rule if you can save millions of people. And you can see here, but the notion of rights here should be inalienable or inviolable, right? And so for the utilitarian, that's not going to be the case. So there's a little bit of a problem there. Also consider the demands of justice. Famously, there was an argument about the civil rights movement that during the civil rights movement, there was a debate about utilitarianism. And a famous philosopher, American philosopher at the time said, but wait a second, imagine there's a race riot. There's blacks and whites fighting in Montgomery or something, and there's a riot, and people are getting killed, and it's a disaster. The city's being laid waste, and people are dying. And what if the only way to stop it is to pick someone off the street and use them as a scapegoat? If that one person's life can be sacrificed to save everyone else, doesn't that make it right for a utilitarian? And the answer is, well, yes, it would. But of course, the problem is justice, because justice demands that only the people who actually commit crimes are the ones who are punished. And so you can see here, is utilitarianism actually a sufficient theory to maintain the justice, a conception of justice that we contend is necessary for our political and civil institutions? And then finally, maybe utilitarianism is too demanding. Right? Maybe the idea of trying to calculate everyone's happiness is just simply ludicrous, and it's not actually possible, nor is it desirable. For instance, some feminist care ethics theorists contend just that. Maybe utilitarianism is actually too much to actually base an actual live normative theory on. And there's more theoretical problems, but here we are an hour in, so I'm going to conclude our video. I hope that you've seen, I hope you've enjoyed the video here, and I hope you've seen that there's a whole series of discussions, a whole series of concepts that we should be asking for when we engage in the question of how we ought to act. On the one hand, we saw with Kant that there's maybe a duty to action based in reason, but on the other hand, don't the ends justify the means, at least sometimes? I'll leave that question with you to contemplate. Thank you very much for watching, and I look forward to seeing you guys online later.